Welcome back. This is your host, Gabe Morales. Like I said, at that time, MA members and associates were not validated, but individuals like Bill Hankins had their own lists of who they believe was members based on their conversations with informants and good intelligence gathering. By the way, I have a book coming out soon with Corey Cooper, president of the Tennessee Gang Investigators Association. It is called The Four Eyes: Interviewing, Interrogations, Investigations, and Intelligence. That should be released later this year for all you cops in corrections. Continuing with part 2 of the Charlie last names of members who belong to the Mexican Mafia over the past 60 plus years. I'll begin again with Manuel Muskie Castaneda was from Maravilla, and he had a D number. He was an active MA member at Folsom Prison in 1985, and I understand is now deceased. Jesus Robert Castaneda Toledo, a.k.a. Beto, a.k.a. Coyote, was from Mexico, Tijuana to be exact, but also had some dealings in San Diego. He had a D number as well as a federal BOP number. I understand he was involved in a homicide in September 1994, then shipped to the ADX in Florence, Colorado. He was released in May 2003 and most likely was deported. Edgar Guilty Castillo was from Los and had a K number. I showed he was made MA by 2001 and was incarcerated at Pelican Bay from 2001 to at least 2012. He is currently at CTF in Soledad. Lorenzo Lencho Castillo had a K number after he was found guilty of a carjacking. He was involved in a riot at San Quentin in 1996, and sometime around then he was given MA status. He was then shipped out to Pelican Bay, and I show is no longer in custody. Steve Smiley Castillo was from Corona. He was close to Daniel Cuategrajeda. Smiley had a D number and was very involved in the hunger strikes that helped shut down the SHU. He was considered to be a jailhouse lawyer. His sponsors into the MA were Jaco Padilla and Angel Valencia, who later both fell out of favor. I also understand that Smiley's membership was vetoed by Boxer Enriquez, who himself fell out of favor. I believe Smiley is somewhere out in the streets, hopefully enjoying the good life instead of La Vida Loca. William Tuffy Castillo was from San Jose. He is one of the few early Northern California MA members. He had an A number and was housed at Folsom Prison with many of the heavy carnales as seen here. My understanding is he was killed in 1976 by the NF, but there's a lot of people who say that the NF only killed one carnal, that being Cheyenne Caena. I'm not so sure about that. Daryl Dashing D. Castrillon was involved in the murder of a Crip member named Lou Montgomery at San Quentin in June of 1984. I understand that the Tower Shields shot him in the eye, and after that he had to wear a patch. And although he no longer wears the patch, he could still see the damage that was done to his eye. He was very involved in the Father's Day massacre at Folsom Prison that occurred shortly before I started working there, whereby the Mexican Mafia attacked the blacks. After that, Dashing D was sent to Corcoran Prison, and he fought against Cuategrajeda. I understand that he also was involved in the hit on Frankie B., Frankie Walnut, at Characters nightclub located in Pomona, where I've been many times. And I understand he is still wanted for that case, and is probably hiding out somewhere down in Mexico. Eduardo Deadeye Castro was from Barrio Nueva Estrada. He was present at the 1992 MA meeting, and was also involved in a shootout with the LA Sheriff's deputies. His brother ended up being a major informant on the MA, and a lot of people believe that Eddie Boy was killed in Barrio Nueva Estrada in May 2019. His brother being Ernest Chuco Castro, also from VNE, who had a late C number. Chuco was very active and was sponsored by longtime MA member Topo Peters, sometime in the early 1980s. He was very active at Chino's Palm Hall in the early 90s. Chuco was also very involved in holding meetings with Sureños to implement the MA edict, and dropped out a couple years after that, whereby he was working for law enforcement who swooped up a bunch of MA in the RICO cases. Ruben Arturo Night Owl Castro was a major 18th Street member. He had a late B number and was made Mexican Mafia sometime in the 1980s. He then hit the street in the 1990s and was very involved in MA politics, including ordering hits on several Sureño gang members who were not toeing the line. Nightall ended up being indicted in the RICO case of 1995 and sent to the federal system, where he was given life without parole. He has been housed at the ADX for at least the last 20 years. Kenneth, aka Solo, aka Candy Cervantes, was from City Terrace. Kenny was a drug dealer who was sent to the federal system and I believe did some time at Atwater. He was released in 2006, and I haven't heard from him in many years now. Robert Gypsy, aka Chino Cervantes, was from Arta, and he committed a murder in July 1997. He had a D number in CDC and was made an M member, and he did some time at Pelican Bay. I understand he was then shipped off the feds, then came back, and has been housed at Richard J. Donovan in San Diego in recent years, but still has that federal hold hanging over his head. Peter Pee Wee Chagoya was from Rivas and had a B number. I show that he was killed with his brother, Tommy Chagoya, who was also an MA member, and they were both killed in 1973. Daniel Hapo Chapa was from Hawaiian Gardens. He had an A number, and I show was an MA member sometime in the 1960s. He was one of the individuals involved in the Shoe War of 1968. I then show that he was housed at the California Men's Colony in 1974 and overdosed in 1982. Arthur Pelon Chavez, I believe, was either from Temple Street or Arizona Mata. He had an A number and hit CDC in the early 1960s. He was listed on a 1964 roll call card of Mexican Mafia members. I show that he was also involved in the murder of Jim Tremblay with Little Sluggo at CTF Soledad. I believe Tremblay was killed on November 13, 1968. I also understand that an AB Native American member by the last name of Titman was involved in that hit. I also show that Pelon was involved in the murder of Nuestra Familia members in December 1972. Arthur Tudy Chavez was from Rancho San Pedro. He had a B number, and I show he was on that 1967 Mexican Mafia roll call. Cesar Bruno Chavez was from the Avenues and hit CDC with B number 13578. Bruno was very involved in Mexican Mafia hits and murders. Evidently, Bruno was killed in February 1977 by Alfie Sosa and Güero Shyrock for dissing Mexican Mafia shot caller Robot Salas. Frank Chino Chavez was a real big guy and I understand was born in Chandler, Arizona. He was made MA sometime in the late 1960s, was housed at Chino CIM in the late 70s, did time in New Mexico in the mid-80s, and was still active until at least 2004 when he was an old man. I understand he was even involved in a cell fight in Folsom 4A, which was the adjustment center for Old Folsom, whereby multiple corrections officers were hurt. Any old-time OGs, let me know if you remember that incident. Philip Chano Chavez was from San Bernardino, Barrio Mount Vernon, Rifa. He had an E number, and I show was MA in the 1990s, and went to Pelican Bay, where he was involved in the C facility versus D facility war, and evidently was murdered in October 1995. He had been running dope for Tupi Hernandez, who fell out of favor. I understand he actually was killed by a nearby gang. Richard, a.k.a. Slick Rick Chavez, was from F Troop out of Orange County. He had an E number, and I show was MA by at least 2003, if not before, but OD'd in August 2004. William Termite Chavez was from Los, and I understand was involved in a murder in 1990. He ended up getting shipped to CDC, where he was given his E number. He did time at Pelican Bay State Prison and is currently housed at High Desert State Prison. Juan Sneaky, a.k.a. Conejo Cifuentes, was from 18th Street. He was convicted on a murder case and in 1994 given his J number. He then was made MA sometime after that, was housed at Salinas Valley State Prison in 1998, and had several girlfriends running dope for him out of that pinta and out of the LA County Jail. Luis Coño Cisneros was a Mexican Mafia member in the BOP. Michael Gangster Clark was from San Diego. He had an E number and was later made a Mexican Mafia member. I show that he was involved in attempted murder in 1991 at Richard J. Donovan, and I lost track of him in recent years. Sal Colavella Diaz is from San Diego, Logan Heights, and has a camouflage MA tattoo on his right knee. He had a K number in CDC and was a shot caller at Richard J. Donovan around 2001. He also was housed at Calipatra and Centinela around 2006. I understand he even ordered a hit on National City Police. He was arrested in January 2012, convicted and sent to the feds. where he was housed at the Coleman facility where I've taught on gang for the BOP. Robert Bobby Green Conigliario was an MA member who had an A number and was close to La Cosa Nostra, the Italian Mafia in LA. He was MA in the 1960s, housed at San Quentin in 1966, paroled in 1973, then caught a murder case in 1978 where he came back with the C number. Maybe he appealed on that case because he paroled in 1982, then came back in 1994 on the dope case, and I haven't heard from him in many years. Joaquin, a.k.a. Jackie, a.k.a. Jesse Garcia Contreras, was from Barrio Nueva Estrada. He had a C number and was housed at the California Training Facility in Soledad in 1984. He ended up paroling and came back with an E number, where he had Mexican Mafia status. I may have said it before, but this status is very much like being a made Cosa Nostra member. You basically have a license to do whatever you want out on the streets or in prison, as long as you follow some basic rules. And even sometimes then they break the rules. So there's a lot of guys that aspire to get that carnal status, to get that black hand. But if you ever listen to some of the other YouTube stations, most of those guys regret doing it. And most of the camaradas that support the Mexican Mafia tell story after story of being burned by the organization. In other words, there's not a lot of solid carnales out there, according to these individuals. But you can't tell a youngster that. Sometimes they have to learn the hard way. Francisco, a.k.a. Conejo Flores, was from Brole, the 619 Rampla. He had a T number, and there's a lot of people who dispute he was MA, but I've listened to his war stories, and he definitely was in the mix. I believe he was MA, just maybe not validated. I believe he was housed at CRC Norco in the 1980s and did a hit for Joe Morgan shortly after that. According to him, he was held at Cypress Hall at CIM and was given the palabra pesada by none other than Joe himself in 1985 in El Hoyo, the hole. After that, he claims he worked as a tier tender in 1986 at CIM and was involved in a riot there at Sycamore, where either he worked or was sold on the third tier. Because of the area where he was from and his dope connections, he claims to have worked under Gato Martinez, a very well-respected MA member for many years at Folsom Prison in 1986, and that he continued to run dope for Joe Morgan. He states that his cellie was none other than Güero Caballo, high-ranking 18th Street gang member, was also a Mexican Mafia member. After putting in all the work for Joe and Gato, I understand that he was made MA at Tehachapi Shoe in 1987. He was then sent to Corcoran Shoe, whereby he was sold with Denny Boy Pena. Like I said, this guy would not be sold with some of these heavyweights if he wasn't somebody. He then ran into Joe Morgan again in 1988. And in Pelican Bay in 1989, he claims his cellie was Tupi Hernandez from Ontario Black Angels. After that, he was sent to the federal system, first to Florence, where he was sold with Luis Boxer Venegas. He was involved in some riots in Tejas over the Texas MA dissing Peter San Ojeda. He then was sent back to Tehachapi in 2018, and sometime after that, he dropped out, which is when he told all these war stories. And I'm not sure of his current status. And so that concludes our roll call of Mexican Mafia members with the last name of C, as in Charlie. I hope you learned something. For now, this is Gabe Morales signing off for Gangsters, Cops, and Politicians.